Welcome to the Mayo Clinic Human Optimization Project, where we're creating the blueprint to help you become the best human you can be so you can give your gifts back to the world. I'm your guide and fellow optimizer, Christopher Camp. If you've ever experienced self-doubt, felt like you didn't have what it takes, or were fearful of being found out, this episode's for you. We've all had the unfortunate experience of improperly doubting ourselves and our abilities to the extent that they have a negative impact on how we feel about ourselves and diminish our performance. Self-doubt and imposter syndrome can be paralyzing, but life is too short for us to live in constant fear and doubt about our abilities. Accordingly, our episode today is titled Overcoming Self-Doubt and Imposter Syndrome. And our expert guest is Cade Cowan. Cade holds a master's degree in organizational and social psychology from Columbia University, and he's worked with some of the world's top companies in over 30 countries. He previously worked in GE's John F. Welch Leadership Development Center and was later responsible for Coca-Cola's global leadership development. He's now a managing partner for Executive Development Consulting, where he has coached senior-most leaders in companies such as Microsoft, Walmart, Google, John Deere, and many more. He's co-author of the book, The Unfinished Leader, Balancing Contradictory Answers to Unsolvable Problems. And he is known for bringing a wide range of resources and unique perspectives to leaders who are confronting modern challenges of leading large-scale, complex enterprises. So we're going to divide our discussion up into three big sections today. Each one has a themed question. In the first section, our big question is, what exactly is imposter syndrome and what are the downsides? The second big question is, how common is self-doubt and how can we tell if it's impacting us? And then in the third section, we'll get to some solutions. And our big question there is, what steps can we take to overcome imposter syndrome and develop healthy confidence to become our best selves? Well, Cade, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the Human Optimization Project.
It's my pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be asked, so thank you.
And this is one that I think we're going to see ourselves in different areas, and everybody's probably going to be able to connect with this topic a little bit. We've all experienced it in different capacities in different ways, and so I think it's going to be pretty applicable for our audience. So let's start. We'll jump into the first section, and I think it's always helpful just to start with definitions. So in your opinion, how do you personally define imposter syndrome?
So imposter syndrome is really, it relates to our ability to internalize our achievements. So, with imposter syndrome, we can have a resume that validates our reason for being in the room that we're in. And we perform well. But in the end, we don't actually internalize the achievement. We explain it away. We'll assign external factors to it as opposed to our own internal capability. So really, it's this idea of I had a success, but rather than congratulating myself for the success and recognizing all of the hard work and the experiences that I've collected over the years that have led to the success, I explain it away. And there's this sneaking feeling, thus the name imposter, that somebody's going to find me out. Somebody's going to discover I'm a fraud and I shouldn't be in the room and I'm lesser than. So that's really kind of where that would be the definition, or at least the one that I ascribe to it. The idea has been around for a while. The original researchers, Clance and Imes, kind of coined the phrase in like the late 70s, like 1978. And what's interesting about that period, Christopher, is that's when a lot of women were beginning to achieve success, in the workplace. And regardless of the fact that these women had high test scores, they had advanced degrees, they had a record of success, they felt as if they didn't belong there. And so Clance and Imes got interested in this idea, and they originally coined it the imposter phenomenon, which is what we've now come to call the imposter syndrome. So that's kind of the origin, and which I think is apropos. It's interesting. I think it's apropos to mention those origins because as we go on, one of the things that we know is sometimes women, as well as those in the ethnic minority perhaps feel it a bit more because of that lingering feeling of perhaps I don't belong here, or I don't see a lot of people around me who look like me. We can go into that a bit, but I think the origins of it are appropriate to mention, just given that it's still applicable today.
hmm And I think one of the keys that you mentioned is oftentimes it's the ability to sort of explain away our achievements in the face of evidence that suggests that they are real or legitimate too. And I remember for me personally, when I matched into orthopedic residency, I got the letter. It says here's where you're going. This is what you're doing. It's all official. It's right there. And then even after I got that, still didn't totally believe it and showed up and said, I'm not sure that I'm really supposed to be here or that I belong, despite the fact that I had the official, letterhead and documentation and went through the whole process and everything. And everybody else is, of course you are. You went through the process. And so it's often in contradiction to that clear evidence that says otherwise. And I wonder how that relates to the concept of just having low self-confidence or humility. And because I think all of these concepts are a little bit interrelated but different.
They are, and it's a good thing to parse those two things out. So I would think of low self-confidence as more of, I'd call it global versus specific. So in other words, if I have low self-confidence, that's kind of that's a global way of thinking, my global way of thinking. So low self-confidence means I'm not up to the task. I don't actually think I'll be successful. And so low self confidence means that I might steer away from the opportunity because I don't think I'm actually going to be able to do it. Imposter syndrome is I actually did it. And the fact is, a lot of those that suffer from imposter syndrome actually are high performers, they're high achievers. And so they're looking for the opportunity, right? And then they go through it, they succeed, but then they don't actually give themselves credit for the success. So I call that kind of specific. So global is low self-esteem. In general, I don't think I'm up for the task. Imposter syndrome, I actually achieved it. I did it. I delivered, but now I'm going to explain it away. I got lucky or, and my, or I charmed them, for instance. I'll do a lot of work in front of executive audiences and, I've said, and people have said, oh, great job. And I'll say, oh, well, it was just a good audience. That's explaining it away. That's robbing myself of saying, actually, no, you brought 20 years of experience into the room. You know your stuff. You've studied this. You don't refer to any of that. You say, oh, I just had a good audience. They were a warm, friendly audience. So that's low self-esteem. Low self-esteem, I might shy away from the opportunity because I don't think I'm going to do it. Imposter syndrome, I did it, but now I'm not going to give myself credit for it.
Ah, very interesting. And so I would imagine there's a little bit of there can be some overlap. You can't have both, but you probably can have just one or the other, and they're not exactly the same thing.
Yeah, and then you mentioned humility. Humility is more grounded in an emotional way of being. I mean, working in leadership development, we like to see humility, right? We want the person that says, "Look, I don't know the answer, but I can find it out. I'm not an expert in this yet, but there's an opportunity for me to learn." So humility, I kind of pull away from the idea of imposter syndrome. I think those are two somewhat different constructs.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the term humility often gets confused in our society today. And a lot of people think that humility is sort of about putting yourself down and belittling yourself, which I think is not necessarily the case. There's a great C.S. Lewis quote, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. So it's just, you're not putting yourself down. You're just not making yourself the center of everything, which I think is maybe tangential, but very, very much different than low self-confidence and imposter syndrome as you described. So I think definitely three different entities we're talking about here.
Exactly right. And with humility, I think it was Adam Grant that coined the term, or at least used the two words together in a way that was popularized. He talked about confident humility. It's the ability to, on one hand, be humble, but on the other hand, be confident that as challenges arise or new topics arise, that you have the ability to comprehend, that you have the ability to learn. So that's more, again, I think a separate construct, one worth a different episode, perhaps.
Yeah, well, let's jump. You mentioned the concept of confidence, and I'm wondering, is there an opposite problem to imposter syndrome? Can somebody not have enough of it, or can they be overconfident?
I think I actually talk about this a lot with executives. I mention this a lot. Perhaps you've heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Oh, yes.
So Dunning-Kruger, it's practically the opposite of imposter syndrome. So think of it this way. Imposter syndrome would be high competence, low confidence, right? So I've got the ability to do it, but I did it, and now I'm not really confident that that was me. I just got lucky. The Dunning-Kruger effect is where I have low competence but high confidence. In other words, I'm shooting too high. And there's some really, these stories get funny. One of the authors that I love, Arthur Brooks, writes for The Atlantic. He cites a New Zealand study where 80% of drivers said they were above average in their ability to drive. Let's think about the math there, right? And then the other one that's perhaps my favorite is the Washington Post in 2023. They cited a YouGov survey that said 32% of Americans were confident, actually very confident in their ability to land a commercial airplane if the pilot became incapacitated. 32%. Now let's just think about that, Christopher. Like when you start, and then they interviewed a pilot that said, tell us about how foolhardy that actually is. And they said, well, start by the fact that we now lock our doors, right? Post 9/11,
Right.
we lock the doors. So you got to get into the cockpit first.
Right.
You've then got to somehow wrestle probably a 200-pound man, typically,
Mm.
out of the seat, out of a very cramped quarters before you even get into the pilot seat. So, like, think about how ridiculous that statement actually is, 32%. And by the way, that was about 50% of men, 20% of women. So
Sure.
there's an interesting little
That
study. But
checks
that's
out.
that's this Dunning-Kruger effect, where we actually way overstate our competence. That's the opposite. In some ways, I think that's more dangerous. Now, you don't
So,
see it as often, particularly in the boardrooms, the executive tables that I get the opportunity to sit at. Certainly, you can at times.
so in a lot of ways, really what we're striving for here is to try to get our confidence to align with our competence. And
Exactly.
and in reality, we want both to increase, but they need to increase appropriately and in relation to one another
That's a really
directly.
good way to put it.
Okay. So we know some of the downsides of imposter syndrome. One, it feels terrible. We've all sort of experienced it. You don't feel like you belong. You're putting yourself down, and so it feels bad. But what are some other potential downsides to experiencing imposter syndrome?
Yeah, so part of it relates to how a person experiences it. So this cycle that we tend to go through that sets up the imposter syndrome is, so there's a trigger event, right? So you've been invited to speak somewhere, or you've been invited to present to the CEO or some high stakes event. And because, again, typically those with imposter syndrome are high achievers, they accept it, right? They say yes. Immediately, they get anxiety about the situation. And so typically there is one of two responses to that anxiety. One is overwork. So I am going to over prepare. And the other is I'm going to procrastinate. I dread it, I fear it, and I'm going to put it off. And by the way, that's my response. And everybody that works with me will tell you that's my response to their great consternation. But for those that are the over preparers, you can imagine it's like burnout, long, long hours. There is, obviously the stress that goes along with that. There's all the stories that you tell yourself about what's going to happen. So, you know, mental anxiety, depression. There's even been in some examples, particularly in high stakes environments like medicine, where people talk about suicidal ideation. So it can go really far. Now, most people aren't going to go that far. But they are going to experience the burnout and the overwork. This idea of, just think about it. If you're saying, look, they're going to find me out, I got to be the smartest person in that room. And that room's going to be full of really smart people. You're going to work really hard, but you're going to overwork. And if you take on every challenge with that amount of vigor, you can imagine burnout is waiting for you.
Mhm. And I think too sometimes, oftentimes people will sense that a little bit as well, which then it may end up you may become a self fulfilling prophecy here if you don't have the confidence in yourself, and then you portray that to others, it could end up resulting in them losing that as well. So, I think it's important for us to try to jump in and intercept this process and stop it if we can. In order to do that, we have to understand a little bit more about how it develops. So, is there certain patterns that this tends to follow and how this comes about within us?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, some would say that it starts really early in childhood, right? We've all got this voice of the critic. First time I ever heard that was from a gentleman named Jim Lair. Jim was a famous sports psychologist who later founded the Human Performance Institute. And I had the good opportunity to bring him into several clients that I worked with. And, he talked about the voice of the critic. What's that voice that's running in our head? Usually it's a pretty unkind voice. It's saying meaner things to you than you would say to anybody else. Now Jim will go on to say that, oftentimes that voice is a parent's voice that we've internalized. So, we sometimes those can be critical voices, as we know, and we carry that with us. And so that's where some would say that it starts. But then you've also got to look not only at the individual factors, but there can also be environmental factors that I think probably take that voice and make it louder for us. So certainly some cultures, some work cultures, where there's not a high degree of collaboration or a high degree of trust, you can imagine how that would exacerbate the issue. Um, Certainly for people of color or people who are disadvantaged in any way, number of ways, if they're at a table where they are the only person there and where the rest of that table doesn't necessarily value diversity or dissenting voices, the idea of being an imposter syndrome may not just be a voice in your head. There may be subtle messages being sent that you are somewhat of an intruder. So I think we got to think about, to what extent is this something that I carry with myself, and which in many instances it's true, but also what about the organization I'm in? And then maybe what about the organization I'm leading? I work in leadership. What is our organizational culture doing to make people feel welcome and not, in fact, an intruder or an imposter? So I think you got to look at both. And then, of course, I mean, there are people who are expert in the harms of social media who could speak much more competently than I can on this. But, look at what we look at all day long when we're scrolling. Somebody said we compare our behind the scenes reality to somebody else's highlight reel, right? And so that's an unfair comparison. But man, we're swimming in that pool all the time. And so that certainly I think contributes to the problem as well.
Oh, those are great. Yeah, honestly, I think for all of us, it's really probably all of those things are contributing in different ways and in different degrees and amounts. And I know one of the things, oftentimes when you're experiencing imposter syndrome, it can lead you to want to retreat a little bit to say, all right, I don't belong. Let me back out. I'm not going to take that risk. I'm not going to take this chance. I'm not going to do this thing. But at the same time, one of the things we talk about a lot in society today in the performance space is having a growth mindset and sort of trying to push yourself into those situations where you might feel a little uncomfortable or you're sort of at the edge of your abilities and the edge of what you're capable of doing. How do you balance that? Because if you're somebody who struggles with imposter syndrome, if you're trying to have a growth mindset and you're pushing yourself into difficult situations, are you setting yourself up for failure and maybe working against yourself? How do you balance those two competing interests?
So there's an old term. It feels somewhat archaic in some ways. It's not very widely shared. It's called I learned this in a program on adult learning, which was essentially the zone of proximal development. And the zone of proximal development is essentially where is that space that challenges us enough to keep us interested, to keep us digging, but is not so far from where we currently are that it doesn't produce a feeling of overwhelm. So we got to balance that. It's kind of like that idea of confident humility. Where are you, how are you balancing between what you don't know and need to learn and what is too much too soon? So, I think about, I, I hate to use the expression stay in your lane because a lot of times when you think stay in your lane, that's kind of pejorative. That's putting somebody in their place. But I think of that, particularly when I think of imposter syndrome, it helps me. It's like, where am I expert? Can I define where I'm expert? And am I really aware of when I move beyond that? Because if I'm moving beyond my zone of expertise, I just want to declare that. You know, we talk about confident humility. The ability to say, I don't know is tantamount to confident humility. I love Frances Fry. She's a Harvard professor, and I've had the good opportunity to listen to her a number of times in a client where we've brought her in. She's got a huge TED Talk. I think her TED Talk's one of the most listened to ever. And she talks about trust, and she talks about the trust triangle. And there are 3 points to this trust triangle, and these are ways that we engender trust in others. And she talks about 1 point of that triangle being, the logic. And she talks about this logic wobble. And she said, when people have logic wobbles, it's because they tend to move beyond their domain of expertise, if you will, and yet they don't declare it. She said, you can be really smart and you can make 5 really spot on observations or statements. But when you go beyond what you know and you make that one wobbly statement, that's what people are going to remember. So for me, that's one thing that I'm thinking about. If I'm presenting to a group of executives, what am I expert on? There I can make some declarative statements. There I can be confident. But when we move into areas that I clearly know nothing about, and when I'm sitting with, a senior team and somebody from supply chain is speaking, there's a lot that they talk about that I have no idea what they even mean. So in that moment, I'm never going to make a statement, but I'll ask a question. I'll demonstrate curiosity. And so I think being able to understand where I am expert and declaring where I'm not, when I'm not, is one way to project that confident humility, if you will. I'll tell you a story. When I was 28 years old, and I hate to say that was in the last century, that date has a 19 in front of it.
Been a minute, yeah.
I was 28, and it was the first time I was presenting. I was working at GE Crotonville, and back at the time, GE Crotonville was this worldwide renowned center of leadership development. And so we would have customers who would come to Crotonville to learn about how GE did certain things. And I had to present to the CEO of Motorola as a 28-year-old. And you can imagine everything I was telling myself. What's a kid from Tennessee, 28 years old, doing, presenting to the CEO of Motorola and his team? They are going to eat me alive. And before I went out there in what I would describe a moment of grace, I just heard the message. Look, they know so much more than you know about so many things, but they don't know more than you know about this one little topic. And that's what you're going to go talk to them about. And that's where you're going to stay. And, that kind of has guided me since. Where can I make assertions? Because it's in my zone of expertise. And anytime I get out of that, I declare it, or I just start asking good questions. And that's one way I navigate it.
Yeah, I think that's tremendous. And I've actually found similar to that. I find it's helpful sometimes to state that up front too. So if you're talking to that group, say, okay, here's what I know, here's what I don't know. And I find myself very commonly saying, well, you know a lot more about this than I do. Tell me what you think. And I feel very comfortable saying that or admitting it. And oftentimes I say, this is what I'm going to focus on. I still don't have all the answers. I'm still growing. This whole human optimization concept, like, this is a journey. It's not a destination. I'll never have all of the answers, but I'm pretty dedicated to learning as much as I can, and I'm going to take everybody along with me. So come on, let's go.
That's a wonderful way to do it. I'll sometimes say, look, I don't have data on this, but I can tell you what my observational data is. and we can talk about it, but so I do, just hedge a bit.
Mm.
But we know that a sign of confidence is the ability to state what you don't know. And I think others recognize that, whether they're grounded in the science of emotional intelligence or not. I think they recognize it, that when you're declaring what you don't know, here's a stand-up person. They're not trying to pull wool over my eyes in any way.
Well, and in reality, so much of imposter syndrome is that we're afraid that we're going to be found out. And we all sort of understand what that means. So then you got to ask yourself, okay, what is it you're afraid that they're going to find out about you? And if that's what you're worried about, just tell them. Tell them what that thing is, and now there's no discovery. There's nothing. All your cards are out on the table, which I think can be helpful.
You start making claims about things that you don't know a lot about, guess what? You're an imposter.
Hmm.
Right? You
Right.
are an imposter in that moment. So the way to avoid it is to simply state what you don't know.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how common this is and kind of where it's coming from. I know we all experience this in different degrees, and I've seen some research that has shown that depending on the group, it's can be up to 80% of people are experiencing at a given time. But I'm wondering, where is it coming from? Like, whose fault is it? Is this a personal failing? Is it an organizational failing, or is this a societal failing that imposter syndrome is so common?
Yeah, I think it relates to some of what we were saying earlier, this idea of, yes, there is the individual brings something to bear, certainly. Whether that's just, again, that voice of the critic, or this underlying ongoing self-doubt. But as we said, organizations can contribute to that as well. Um, one of the things, I had the good opportunity, Christopher, to consult to Microsoft for 8 years. One of the highlights of my career thus far. I loved those folks, incredibly smart people. And while I was during those 8 years, part of that was before Satya Nadella, and then part of that was after he came on board as CEO. And what I loved about Satya's leadership was he introduced this idea, early in the day. And by the way, he was a huge fan of Carol Dweck and the growth mindset. He said that the growth mindset was instrumental in the way that he reshaped Microsoft's culture. This idea, he talked about moving from a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. Early, before he kind of declared that, in some of his early meetings, he would talk about the difference between the performing zone and the learning zone. And so in the performing zone, he expected you to know your stuff, right? We're talking asking questions about your business and your results. It's important that you know it. But man, when we're talking about at that time emerging technologies like quantum computing or AI, there's so much we don't know. Let's move into this learning zone where all we're really doing is asking good questions. It's okay not to know. And so I think organizations that can't admit what they don't know, we've been talking a lot about us as individuals admitting what we don't know. When a collective group of people come together and they can't talk about what they don't know, that's a really unsafe place for people to be. And that's going to, for those that are feeling like imposters, that's going to exacerbate that feeling. And so again, my area of expertise, what I practice is all around leadership development. And so if I'm working with a senior leader, I'm working with a CEO, we'll talk about how do you instill a culture around you, or even a feeling around the top table, that it's okay not to know, that we can have exploratory conversations, that we can run experiments where what we know is not important, but how quickly we can learn is important. So I think absent those types of leadership mindsets, then absent those cultures can exacerbate that feeling of imposter syndrome. And then, of course, back to the societal failings, I think, again, as we were saying, that's a lot of what's true about social media these days. So much gets filtered and everybody looks expert. I mean, I can scroll through Instagram, and in 15 minutes, everybody is fitter than I am.
Yeah.
Everybody's house is much better decorated for the holidays. Their dogs are much more well trained, and we go on and on and on. So suddenly I can feel like, regardless of the achievements that I might think that I've racked up, I'm still feeling pretty lousy. So I think there's a societal failing in there as well, certainly.
Yeah. And I think we all feel this, and our relationship with imposter syndrome probably ebbs and flows a little bit over time. Do you feel like there are certain times when we are more prone to experience it? Is it certain life transitions, certain ages, certain careers, whatever? What are some of the common denominators that maybe set us up or put us at risk for imposter syndrome that we should look out for?
So yeah, there are, a lot of times people who are going through transitions. So for instance, when they've been promoted, they're in a brand new role. Um, Corn Ferry did a survey just in 2024, and 71% of CEOs admitted that they felt it. Howard Schultz, CEO of Starbucks, he said, look, not many CEOs are going to tell you this, but many of us feel like we don't know what we're doing. We shouldn't be here, in not so many words.
Right.
There was one gentleman that I coached who I had first met him when he was running a large region for a retailer. He had hundreds of stores that he was responsible for. Then I saw him go on to lead this organization's online experience. And then I saw him become CEO of another company. And so he asked me to be his transition coach. And I remember him saying, man, he said he went into this new organization as COO, and then he was later promoted to CEO. And he said, Cade, he said, I'm telling you, on day one, when I became CEO, people started asking me really hard questions. He's like, I didn't know. I didn't know. So yes, transitions, certainly. I think people that are in, very how would I say it? Smart organizations, right? Medicine, law, executive levels. When you are in a performance rich environment, that would certainly be an environment that could foster it. And then, I'd say it again, in areas, in situations where perhaps you are the only person that looks like you, that's going to be an example as well. I mean, my gosh, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, she talks about having imposter syndrome. Maya Angelou talked about it. Michelle Obama said the feeling never goes away. These are three women, all from ethnic minorities. They have a common experience there. They have ventured into territory where a few people who look like them are around them. So that's a situation where it's going to prompt itself as well.
And I think those are great. And as you're going through those, it all clicks and it makes perfect sense. And I was thinking another area for me, I think, is often after a recent failure. Sometimes you have a big failure, especially if it's a big one or important one. You start to question things more, a little bit more, and maybe have a little bit more doubt that creeps in. So I think that's another area.
Can I just tell
So
you a little story about that? I said I worked at GE, and there's this old story about Jack Welch, the famous GE CEO, and one of his senior executives had made a big mistake. I think it was like $10 million, which back in the day when this happened, that was a huge mistake. And Jack called him into the office, and the executive essentially said, well, I guess you're going to fire me now. And Jack Welch said, what are you talking about firing you? I just spent $10 million on your education. So I love that. I don't know that it's that related to the imposter syndrome, but it does show how a leader is responsible for helping those people who have failures frame it into context. I spent $10 million on your education. Education. What are you learning from this? Again, it's not always about points on the board. It's about the rate of my learning.
I think that's fantastic. You're right. And it does give us a chance to reframe those failures and say, okay, I've learned one way or maybe 100 ways of how not to do this. So actually, that should increase both my competence and my confidence going forward. But we often let it have the opposite effect. What are some of the signs we can look out for to know if we're starting to experience imposter syndrome? I think sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it probably creeps in a little bit subtly. We maybe don't recognize it. So what should we look out for to know if it's creeping in?
Well, I'll tell you when I know it's creeping in for me. And when it's creeping in for me is when the voice in my head says, man, I just got to get through this. I just got to survive it. And so I'm in front of senior executives all the time, given the work that I do. And so for me, that is the voice that's in my head. And it typically will occur if I'm inside of an industry that I don't understand that well. So for instance, financial services, those bankers, God love them, they speak a language that the rest of us don't necessarily speak. If I'm in a room full of really smart advanced engineers, it's a language that I don't necessarily speak. So for me, when I'm hearing myself say, I just want to survive this, I know that the imposter syndrome is rearing its head. And the reason that I listen for that, Christopher, is I know that if my mentality is, I just want to survive this, then I'm going to show up in a way that I'm in a protective stance, right? And we know all the brain science. If I'm in a protective stance, it's the amygdala that's firing. It's not the prefrontal cortex. So I am not going to show up in a way that's curious. I'm not going to show up in a way that's playful. I may not work on innovating my content at all. I'm going to live in this small box where I know I've succeeded before because I just want to get through it. So that's mine, and that comes my awareness of that again comes from listening to that voice of the critic. What am I telling myself that's actually not helpful, unkind, detrimental to my success? So for me, that's how I know it's creeping in.
I think that's great, and I think a lot of things to watch out for that show up in subtle ways. As I was preparing for this, and I realized, wow, a lot of this is real. But I think oftentimes even subtle things like deflecting praise after it happens. Somebody thanks you or says good job, and you deflect that, or oftentimes that's either you think you didn't earn it or you didn't deserve it, or you don't want it because you don't think you're worthy of it. And so I think that either attributing your success to others or not being willing to accept thanks, gratitude, and praise for the work that you have done is a pretty good sign as well.
And let's talk about deflecting praise. People do it all the time. I've done it earlier in my career. I've gotten better about now simply saying thank you. But when you deflect praise, not only are you kind of underlining your imposter syndrome, you're giving it, more emphasis than certainly it deserves, but you're also discounting where that person is coming from. You're basically saying you're not worthy to say, right? You're not, oh, thank you, but silly you. It was luck,
Right.
you
What do
know?
you know? Yeah.
So that's kind of a double-edged sword. And so deflecting praise is one that I really do think people need to move on, both for themselves and for the giver of that praise. The person who can find the time and the energy to come and compliment you, you're going to shove it back and say no thanks. No, thank you is the word here.
Yeah, I think that's excellent, fantastic, and we're all guilty of that from time to time.
Christopher, I've got one story that blew my mind when I first heard it. There is an English author. What is his name? It's like Neil. Oh gosh, he wrote The Sandman and The American Gods. I think I've got that right. Neil Heyman, I believe. And he was at a conference and it was full of like authors and writers and scientists. And he was feeling that he didn't deserve to be there. And he was struck up a conversation with who he described as an elderly gentleman. And this elderly gentleman said, man, he said, I don't need to be here. I don't deserve to be here. He said, all I did was go where they told me to go. And Neil looked at this gentleman and he said, but you were the first man on the moon. He was talking to Neil Armstrong. Neil
Wow.
freaking Armstrong. He was saying, I don't deserve to be here. And I
Wow.
sometimes think of that story because, it reminds me of how silly we can be,
Mhm.
when we are in that space, when we're deflecting the praise, when we're externalizing our achievements. Neil Armstrong did it. It sounds so silly coming from him.
Right.
It's probably silly coming from us too.
Yeah, I think it really, honestly, all of us. It really is silly. So let's talk. Let's jump at our third section here. We'll talk about some solutions for how we help people fix this problem. So first, how do we know if it's something we need to improve? Is it too simplistic just to say everybody needs to fix this, or there's some certain things we need to be looking out for to know? Yeah, this is a big deal for me. I really got to focus on this.
Yeah, I think that there are I think we know that something like 70% of people can experience this. I mean, you said it earlier, the stats show a very wide range, but most people agree that something like 70% of people are going to experience it. Women, perhaps a little bit more than men, but it shows up differently in how they deal with it. So let's just accept that it's somewhat universal. So I don't necessarily think that we need to fix it, but we need to think about how do we allow the doubt that we feel to, inspire us or motivate us to continue learning. So you certainly got to fix it as it comes, in so much as it means I'm going to avoid opportunities or I'm going to work myself to death. That part we need to think about fixing. But I think a little doubt is can be helpful if we adopt this growth mindset of I may not be expert here yet. You
Mhm.
know, Carol Dweck, she kind of popularized that idea. She was the first one to talk about how powerful that word yet is.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know if you saw the podcast with Meghan Markle and Jamie Lima, where they started talking about it and it got widely panned because they were just kind of, it felt silly the way that they were saying it and overdone. But there's some real psychological weight to that idea of yet. Hey, I may not know it yet, but I've got the confidence that I'm going to learn it. So that's kind of how I think about this thing is, I've got these coping mechanisms. First of all, I'm going to, as I said earlier, like, how do I stay in my expertise? When I move outside of it, declare that I'm outside of it and start asking really good questions, demonstrate curiosity. And then how do I, remind myself that I do have the wherewithal and the tenacity to continue learning the things that I don't yet know. So that's kind of how I think about it, Christopher. Not so much as fixing it, but embracing it and think about how I use it to spur additional learning.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's very well said. I don't think this is an on-off switch that you can just get rid of it and eliminate it from your life. It's sort of it's a growth process for sure.
One thing I would say that helps is to name it. When you're experiencing it, can you label it as such? One of the coaches that we work with at EDC, Marissa Patterson, she's the first person that I ever heard use the expression name it to tame it.
Hmm.
And once you can name it, you're kind of dissociating from it. It's kind of there's an emotional management technique, which is rather than saying I am angry, I feel anger. Because what we're doing is we're dissociating ourselves from the emotion, and it helps us actually look back at the anger and say, okay, what's causing the anger? That same move can be made with imposter syndrome. I'm experiencing imposter syndrome, not I am an imposter. I'm experiencing imposter syndrome. It allows us to get curious about it. So, what is driving it right now for me?
Yeah, and that allows us to look at it more as sort of a scientist that we've talked about, say, okay, this is an observation I've made. Now what am I going to do? So why don't we let's split these up. You've named several good things and I've been writing them down, but I'd like to maybe split them up in things we should fix in our mindset about this and then maybe some actual behaviors that we could do. So maybe we could put together a couple lists here of things. So let's maybe first run through quickly what are some of the mindset changes that we need to do. And the one you just said there was fantastic, I think. And basically, don't judge yourself for it. Take the negative emotion out of it, which is one of the mindset things I think is helpful. So, sort of be compassionate to yourself for it. What are some other mindset things we should be thinking about?
So, I think that the being compassionate, yes. I think the other mindset shift is, to what extent can you adopt that growth mindset? This idea of I'm not expert yet. I don't know the answer yet. I think those are probably two of the biggest shifts that one can make.
I think that's really helpful. I think another one too is there's often when you're experiencing imposter syndrome, you think you're the only one that has it. But you just mentioned, some of the most successful CEOs and astronauts and other people in our world have experienced it. So you have to recognize that you're not the only one and that this is fairly universal.
If you don't recognize that you're the only one, just listen to that song by Radiohead, Creep. Remember that song,
Yeah,
Christopher?
yeah,
The
yeah,
lyrics, it's like, I don't care if it hurts. I want to have control. I want to have a perfect body. I want to have a perfect soul, right? Like shooting for
yeah.
the best. but
Yeah.
I'm a creep. I'm a weirdo. What the hell am I doing here? I don't belong here. I
Yeah.
mean, how many times has that song been covered? That obviously has resonance for people because so many of us feel it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think when it comes to behaviors, one of the things that we can do is, find our friends, find the people that are going to remind you of your competence, not in a way that blows smoke, but, a trusted peer. Now, I will say sometimes that's hard to find given the world that you occupy. So I think sometimes at senior tables, that can be a tenuous relationship. Maybe everybody's vying for that CEO chair, right? So that might be a hard place. But in other parts of the organization, I don't think it is. I think mentors can really help give us an objective sense of what we do well and where we need to lean in. I've had three people that have contributed to my career that I would assign more uh, praise toward my professional accomplishments than anyone. David Dotlick, Ron Meeks, Vicky Lostetter. All three of them were excellent at telling me what I was good at and where I needed to lean in. And those are the people that you need around you. So,
Oh,
we talk about getting a mentor. And I know earlier in my career, I thought, oh, that sounds fun. I had no idea what purpose they actually served. And those are people to give us that objective dose of reality. What do you do well, and what do you need to work on? So I think
yeah.
finding a mentor is another thing that you want to do.
Oh, I love it. I love it. And I think that that's we have a previous episode where we talk about getting a mentor, being a mentor, the value of them, and not just one. Usually none of them are perfect. These are not demigods or gurus. These are people that are on their own journey. So get multiple people that can help you. And I think sometimes you're right. Get creative. Maybe it is a coworker or a supervisor. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's an accountability partner, life partner. Maybe it's a coach. There's all sorts of different options, and maybe it's all of the above, which I think is really helpful.
Depends on your relationship with that life partner, though, doesn't
It does.
it?
Maybe it mentors for certain aspects, but maybe not for all aspects. Yeah. And I'm going to throw back to what you said earlier on the behavior list. I'm going to also add receive praise and don't reflect it or don't deflect it, which I think is really good. That's something I think we could also add. And then one other thing I want to put on there is I think oftentimes we're guilty of only judging ourselves by the outcome. And the outcome is important. That's usually what we're striving for. But I think it's important to recognize the process and the progress and say, hey, all right, did we have a clear process delineated here, and did we follow that process? Yes. Okay. We can take some joy and satisfaction in that. Now maybe we get to the end and we realize we left out some critical steps. Okay. Now we've learned something new. We're going to change the process and update it. But I think if you can do that, don't just judge yourself on the outcomes, but judge yourself on the effort and work that you put into it.
Let me tell you, I would say that the failures that I've suffered, almost all of them, I can attribute to I steps outside the process that I know works. And
Yeah.
so I do think that you've got to, you aren't just judging the outcome. You got to judge the process. It is not, it's about the effort. It's about the process. It's about the discipline. That's what tends to lead to the success that high performers enjoy. And so they got to remind themselves of that oftentimes, particularly if they're feeling that sense of being an imposter. One other thing I'd say that really can help is, I for about 20 years I've kept an email file that I simply call keepers. It's my
Mm-hmm.
keepers file.
Mm-hmm.
And, when somebody sends an email that said, I shifted the way they were thinking, or, I caused this in their, in some outcome that they were seeking to achieve, I just slide those over into my keepers file. And every now and then when I feel like I'm not up to some task, every now and then I'll open it up and just, be reminded. So you're kind of retraining your brain on, what are the attributions that led to the success.
Yeah.
It wasn't luck. You didn't just fake it, but you contributed to something that resulted in a beneficial outcome for somebody. I keep that file.
Well, I think your keeper file is I love that concept. I love that idea. I actually have a drawer in my office too. I do the same thing where I keep all of the notes I get from patients and cards and things, and I keep them in there. And sometimes you just got to open it up and look at it. And I think what that does is it sort of helps reground us in our values and our purpose and our vision. It sort of resets like, oh yeah, this is why I'm here. This is what I'm doing. This is the real thing that I'm striving for. And so I think that's really great too. And so I'm going to add that to the list. That's really kind of both a mindset and a behavior thing. So, well, Kate, this has been a great discussion. I've learned a lot. I've taken a lot of notes. So I'm going to take a couple minutes here and kind of recap my notes. And after I do that, I'm going to have you give us rapid fire answers to our big three questions. So you started us off with definition of imposter syndrome, which is our ability or tendency to explain away our achievements rather than acknowledging our success. And this is usually done in the face of clear evidence that we actually did accomplish the thing or we did actually do the thing. It's different than low self-confidence. Low self-confidence is saying, I'm not going to do it because I don't think I can. Whereas imposter syndrome, you sort of already have done it, or you've already arrived, or you made it into the room, and then you feel like you don't belong. And I loved how you talked about the difference in sort of imposter syndrome and the Dunning-Kruger, where imposter syndrome, we tend to have high levels of competence, but low levels of confidence. And then Dunning-Kruger is just the opposite. So in that, you have high confidence, but low competence. There's a lot of downsides to it, imposter syndrome as well, too. So we talk about how it increases anxiety, mental illness, burnout, causes us to overwork. I loved your concept of the zone of proximal development, where we have to find the space that challenges us enough but doesn't overwhelm us. And that's kind of how we can balance that growth mindset with the imposter syndrome. And then we talked about different times when we may be particularly at risk for imposter syndrome. So any new transition, new job, you're in an environment that's full of talented, successful, smart people. If you're a marginalized individual and you're in an environment where you feel like maybe you don't belong or you're the only one who looks or sounds like you do, and then often after previous failures, you got to be careful if that happens. We also talked about signs to look out for to know if it's happening to you. And for you, you gave a great example. Anytime you have that feeling, I just got to get through this, you got to look out for it. You spoke to me on that one because I've definitely been there. And then we got a couple sets of different things to look at to try to improve. So both a list of mindset activities and behavior activities. So on the mindset, give yourself compassion, try to have a growth mindset and say, I don't know yet. Know that you're not the only one that's struggling with it. This is a pretty universal problem. We also talk about defining your own success and try to tie things back to your core mission, values, and purpose. And on the behavior side, name it when when imposter syndrome happens. Be sure to name it. Second, you said find friends, which can be really helpful. People who know you, love you, and care about you that can help you. And then take the credit when it's given to you. Don't deflect it. So receive the praise. Get mentors that can help you, and then also credit yourself for the effort that you give and not just the outcome. So enjoy the process. So that's my summary, and I got a lot more that I wrote down here. This was chock full of good information. I'm going to give you a chance to summarize here, Cade. We'll ask you those three big questions again. So number one, what exactly is imposter syndrome, and what are the downsides?
Yeah, the imposter syndrome is when you cannot internalize the success that you're enjoying. I heard it said once, and I loved it. Your brain has not caught up to your resume.
Oh, very good. I love that. Great line. Great line.
And the downsides are, as we said, if you're one who approaches imposter syndrome by over preparing, it's going to be overwork, it's going to be exhaustion, it's going to be burnout. If it's through procrastination, you're going to annoy the people around you. And you're going to sit with a nagging fear, which is going to just kind of erode your sense of well-being. How about that? I'm speaking from personal experience here.
Yeah, I feel both of those actually. All right, second big question. How common is self-doubt and how can we tell if it's impacting us?
Yeah, just, it's a universal experience. And I think that's why, it does behoove us to find people that we can talk about with it. It's 70%, as we said, at least 70% of the population at some point is going to feel it. If you're a high performer, you've likely felt it at some point. That was the first part of your question, how common. What was the second part of your question, Christopher?
How is it impacting us?
I think all the psychological speak aside, isn't it sad that people work as hard as they do uh, and yet can't go home at night with a sense of self-satisfaction, with a sense of pride, that can then impact the people around them. That's one way I'd describe it. Isn't that sad?
And then our third one, what steps can we take to overcome imposter syndrome and develop healthy confidence?
Yeah, sure. So we said name it to tame it, right? We said, make sure that you're accepting praise that benefits both you and the person who found the time and the energy and the niceness to compliment you. We talked about this idea of shifting from I don't know it to I don't know yet. Talked about declaring what we don't know, being transparent about that. It's a sign of humility. It's a sign of confidence. Those are the things that I think are at the top of my list.
Well, you've set this up nicely. I always like to end this with a call to action for our audience, to sort of give them the first step. And honestly, you've given them several lists of great steps. So I would tell for our audience, go back to that third section and re-listen. We talk about all the different mindset things you can work on and also the behavioral things you can work on. And pick one out of those lists and say, okay, this is the thing that I'm going to do. And if you have no idea where to start, I'm actually going to encourage you start on the mindset side, just with having compassion to yourself and recognizing that you're not the only one. In fact, everybody else is doing it. Sometimes I think just that understanding alone can then give you the confidence you need to move forward and take the next steps. So, Cade, thank you so much for joining us. This was a fantastic discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Christopher. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you.
Great. And to our audience, remember to live intentionally, consistently better. Keep striving to be the best human you can be so you can give your gifts back to the world and never stop optimizing. Thanks for listening to the Mayo Clinic Human Optimization Project. If you like this episode, hit subscribe and leave a review. It helps others find us. Know someone who might benefit? Share the episode with them to join us in our mission to help as many people as possible become the best humans they can be. Have feedback or a topic idea? Email us at optimize@mayo.edu. And be sure to look for us on Instagram, X, and YouTube.
This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be relied upon for medical, professional, or legal advice. Always consult with a qualified professional for any questions. The appearance of any guest does not imply an endorsement of them, their employer, or any entity they represent. The views and opinions expressed by the guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Mayo Clinic. Reference to any product, service, or entity is for informational purposes only and does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by Mayo Clinic.